During the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe was a continent gripped by fear of sin, fear of death, and ultimately, fear of divine punishment. Amidst this climate, the Flagellants emerged, a radical religious movement that believed humanity could avert divine wrath through extreme self-punishment. The movement gained particular prominence during periods of crisis, most famously during the Black Death, which decimated nearly one-third of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Flagellants organized themselves into processions, marching from town to town, often in long lines, chanting prayers and litanies. The hallmark of their practice was self-flagellation, literally whipping their own backs with cords, sometimes tipped with metal or knotted to tear flesh. They believed that by physically punishing themselves for the sins of humanity, they could atone not only for their own sins, but also for those of the wider community. Pain and suffering were considered a direct path to spiritual purification and divine mercy. The movement quickly attracted thousands of followers, cutting across social classes. Townspeople, desperate for salvation during plagues and famine, often joined these public rituals. However, the extreme nature of their punishments sometimes led to injury, infection, or even death. Local authorities and the church initially tolerated flagellants, but as their popularity grew, the church began to see them as a threat. Their itinerant lifestyle, public disruption, and radical interpretation of penance challenged the established religious hierarchy. By the late 14th century, the church condemned the movement, labeling it heretical, and authorities cracked down, dispersing processions and punishing participants. Despite their eventual suppression, the flagellants left a lasting mark on European history. They illustrate how fear of death, disease, and divine judgment can drive ordinary people toward extreme behaviors. Their story is a powerful reminder of the human capacity for both devotion and self-destruction when ideology, desperation, and religion intertwine.
In the vast landscapes of India, between the 14th and 19th centuries, a secretive and deadly network known as the Thuggee cult operated with chilling efficiency. The thugs, as they were called, were not merely criminals, they were part of an organized religious society that combined ritual, devotion, and murder. Their primary belief centered on worship of the goddess Kali, the fierce Hindu deity associated with destruction and power. To them, killing travelers was a sacred duty, an offering to the goddess that would bring them spiritual favor and ensure protection. Thugs would often travel in groups, disguising themselves as merchants, pilgrims, or ordinary villagers. They gained the trust of unsuspecting travelers before striking, usually by strangulation, a method they believed was more honorable and spiritually significant than spilling blood. Victims' bodies were hidden, and the cult operated in strict secrecy, maintaining elaborate codes and rituals. The killings were not random, they were highly ritualized acts, with prayers, chants, and ceremonies before and after the murders, reinforcing the belief that these punishments were divinely sanctioned. The cult's influence spread over centuries, and they were feared across large parts of India. It wasn't merely their violence that set them apart, it was their religious justification and the psychological control they maintained over members. Obedience was absolute. Any deviation or refusal to participate in ritual killings was punished, often by death. This combination of religious fervor, secrecy, and systematic violence made the thugs one of the most notorious punishment-based cults in history. It was not until the 19th century, under British colonial rule, that the Thuggee cult was systematically eradicated. British officers, led by officials like William Sleeman, used intelligence networks and coordinated military operations to suppress their activities.
By the mid-1800s, the cult was largely dismantled, though its legacy as a terrifying blend of religion, ritual, and sanctioned violence lingered in the public imagination. The Thuggee cult stands as a stark reminder of how ideology and faith can be manipulated to justify brutality and enforce absolute control over members, blending devotion with death in a way few other cults have ever done.
Following the earlier waves of flagellants, a more structured form of ritual punishment emerged in medieval Europe known as the Orders of the Penitent. Unlike spontaneous flagellant processions, these groups were organized, often semi-monastic, and their members devoted themselves to strict self-discipline and penance. Their central belief was that sin was the source of all suffering in the world, from famine to plague, and that by punishing themselves, they could intercede for the sins of entire communities. Members of these orders subjected themselves to extreme physical penance. They whipped their own bodies, sometimes using cords tipped with iron, endured prolonged fasting, and walked barefoot over burning coals or rough terrain. Public confession and ritual humiliation were common, and the severity of punishment was often proportional to the gravity of perceived sin. In some cases, these orders imposed collective punishments on towns or villages, believing that communal sin could only be expiated through shared suffering. While initially sanctioned or tolerated by the Church, many orders of the penitent eventually came under scrutiny. Their rigid, sometimes violent practices challenged ecclesiastical authority, and their emphasis on direct, personal punishment of sin occasionally bordered on heresy. Yet their influence endured for centuries, particularly during times of social upheaval, famine, or plague, when fear of divine wrath was at its peak. These orders exemplify how punishment can be institutionalized within a religious framework. Unlike the spontaneous flagellants, the orders of the penitent combined ideology, ritual, and social control into an organized system. Their practices reveal a medieval mindset where suffering was not only a personal duty, but a communal obligation, and where extreme self-discipline was believed to be a path to salvation for both individuals and society at large. In the late 18th century, a religious sect known as the Shakers emerged in the American colonies, officially called the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. While they are often remembered for their celibacy, simple communal lifestyle, and innovative craftsmanship, the Shakers also maintained a strict system of behavioral control that included forms of punishment designed to enforce obedience and spiritual discipline. Members were required to follow a rigid daily routine of prayer, labor, and communal worship. Deviations from the rules, whether minor or major, were not tolerated. Punishments could be both psychological and physical. Offenders were publicly reprimanded during meetings, isolated from communal activities, or assigned arduous labor as a corrective measure. Confession was a regular practice, and those who resisted the community's strict moral code faced social and spiritual pressure that could be deeply distressing. Although the Shakers were nonviolent compared to some other groups focused on punishment, their approach demonstrates how social and religious systems can use punishment to enforce conformity. The goal was not harm for its own sake, but the creation of a disciplined, orderly, and spiritually pure community. Children and new converts in particular were subject to strict guidance and correction, which reinforced obedience from an early age. By maintaining such a controlled environment, the Shakers were able to sustain their communities for decades, emphasizing that punishment within a cultic or religious framework need not always be lethal or extreme to be effective. Their practices highlight a subtler form of control, the shaping of thought and behavior through structured discipline, moral expectation, and communal pressure. In 1968, David Berg founded a religious movement in the United States that would later be known as the Children of God, or the Family International. Unlike some earlier punishment-focused sects, this cult combined apocalyptic Christian beliefs with extreme social and moral control. Punishment within the group was central, not just physical, but psychological, emotional, and sexual, designed to enforce obedience, loyalty, and ideological conformity. Members were subjected to strict rules governing daily life, personal relationships, and even thoughts. Disobedience or questioning the leadership often resulted in severe consequences, including public shaming, isolation from the community, denial of privileges, or extreme emotional manipulation. Children and teenagers were particularly vulnerable, indoctrinated from a young age, and punished for sins such as curiosity, questioning authority, or resisting sexual teachings that Berg controversially promoted. The cult's system of punishment reinforced Berg's control, creating an environment of fear and dependency. Followers were encouraged to confess sins publicly, internalize guilt, and rely on the leadership for absolution. By making punishment both spiritual and social, Berg ensured that members would obey even when actions contradicted personal morality. Over decades, the cult expanded internationally, using these punitive structures to maintain cohesion and obedience across diverse countries and cultures. The Children of God illustrates how punishment in a cult is not always physical or ritualistic. It can be psychological, spiritual, and systemic, embedding control deeply into the minds of followers. By intertwining fear, guilt, and ideological reinforcement, the group maintained authority over its members for decades, demonstrating that the most effective forms of punishment are often those that shape thought, belief, and identity. In 1984, Shoko Asahara founded Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, a doomsday cult that combined elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, and apocalyptic Christian prophecy. From the beginning, the cult maintained a strict system of punishment and control to enforce loyalty, suppress dissent, and prepare members for what they believed was the imminent end of the world. Punishment within Aum Shinrikyo was both psychological and physical, ranging from isolation and public humiliation to imprisonment and even death for those who questioned Asahara's authority. Members were indoctrinated to believe that the world was corrupt and doomed, and that only absolute obedience to the leader could ensure spiritual survival. Disobedience or failure to comply with the cult's rigorous training, including meditation, communal labor, and ritual drills, was met with harsh repercussions. Some members were forcibly confined, beaten, or coerced into extreme acts as a demonstration of loyalty and spiritual purification. The cult's capacity for punishment escalated beyond its internal practices. By the early 1990s, Aum Shinrikyo had amassed weapons, trained members in chemical warfare, and carried out violent acts, culminating in the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin gas attack. 13 people were killed and thousands were injured. This extreme act of violence was rooted in the same ideology of punishment and obedience that had governed the cult internally. Dissent and non-compliance were treated as threats to salvation, justifying deadly measures. Aum Shinrikyo demonstrates how punishment in a cult can evolve from internal discipline to external violence. The combination of psychological control, fear of divine or apocalyptic consequences, and ruthless enforcement of obedience created a deadly environment, showing how punitive systems can extend far beyond ritual or self-discipline into mass destruction.
In 18th century Russia, a secretive religious sect known as the Skoptsi emerged, infamous for its extreme practices of self-punishment and bodily mutilation. The Skoptsi, whose name roughly translates to castrated ones, believed that sexual desire was the root of sin and corruption. They practiced castration and mastectomy as a form of ultimate self-purification, convinced that removing sexual organs would bring them closer to God and guarantee salvation. Membership in the Skoptsi was strictly controlled, and compliance with these brutal rituals was mandatory. Punishment for disobedience or hesitation often included shaming, isolation, or coercion into undergoing the procedures. Their ideology fused religious devotion with physical suffering, creating an environment in which fear, guilt, and discipline were inseparable. Entire families were sometimes involved, with parents guiding children into the sect's harsh practices from an early age, reinforcing obedience and doctrinal conformity. The Skoptsi were viewed as heretical and dangerous by both the Russian Orthodox Church and the Tsarist state. Authorities periodically persecuted them, yet the sect persisted underground for over 2 centuries, demonstrating the powerful hold that extreme religious punishment and belief can exert on individuals. By combining physical mutilation with spiritual ideology, the Skoptsi exemplify how punishment can be ritualized to the point of redefining the body itself as a tool of faith and obedience. Their history is a chilling reminder that in some cults, punishment is not just a consequence for wrongdoing. It becomes a sacred duty, a physical manifestation of devotion, and a terrifying method of absolute control over members' lives.
In the United States during the 1970s, a cult known as Heaven's Gate emerged under the leadership of Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. Unlike many earlier punishment-focused sects, Heaven's Gate combined apocalyptic beliefs with a fascination for technology and extraterrestrial life. The group taught that the Earth was about to be recycled and that true salvation required leaving behind the physical body to ascend to a higher extraterrestrial plane. Punishment in this context was internalized. Followers were trained to reject earthly attachments, including family, personal desires, and even basic comforts, as a form of spiritual discipline. The cult enforced strict behavioral rules. Members were expected to live communally, dress identically, and follow regimented routines that included meditation, study, and self-denial. Non-compliance was treated as a failure of spiritual progress, and psychological pressure, shame, and isolation were the primary forms of punishment. Over decades, this system of strict obedience shaped followers' identities entirely around the cult's apocalyptic vision, leaving little room for independent thought or dissent. In March 1997, this ideology of ultimate obedience culminated in a mass suicide of 39 members who ingested a lethal mixture of phenobarbital and vodka, believing it would allow them to ascend to a spacecraft they claimed was trailing the comet Hale-Bopp. The tragedy highlights how punishment in a cult can evolve from daily self-denial and mental discipline to the ultimate form of obedience, sacrificing one's own life in the name of faith. Heaven's Gate demonstrates a modern form of cultic punishment, psychological control reinforced by ideology. Physical violence was largely absent, yet the cult's rigid system of discipline, fear of spiritual failure, and mental conditioning created a structure of obedience so absolute that followers ultimately viewed death as the only path to salvation.